This paper critically examines a novel area of research, the reception of ancient Egypt amongst the 19th century New Zealand public. The topic for this paper sits close to home, blending my love for ancient Egypt and the 19th century New Zealand experience, an experience that many of my ancestors had following their immigration to New Zealand in the 19th century. This paper begins the journey to delve deeper into New Zealand's colonial history to uncover the reasoning behind a Pākehā ambivalence and Māori interest in ancient Egypt identified by Alice Stevenson in her book Scattered Finds. Some of the words you will encounter throughout this talk are listed on the board. Before continuing, I want to set you into the context of 19th century New Zealand. New Zealand entered the British Empire with the signing of the Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840. With the signing of this treaty, a mass migration of Europeans to New Zealand started, predominantly of British origin, spurred on in the 1860s by war and the discovery of gold, and Premier Julius Vogel's assisted migrant scheme in the 1870s. Those from Britain also included people of Irish descent. Europeans were not the only settlers to arrive in New Zealand, with numbers of Chinese and Indian settlers also arriving throughout the 19th century. European settlers quickly began to outstrip the Māori population. During this time, Māori underwent substantial cultural, religious, economic, demographic, and identity changes because of contact with Europeans and subsequent colonisation. For example, Lockie Patterson recognises that prior to first contact, Māori defined identity based on genealogical links and human similarity. After colonisation began, Māori developed an ethnic consciousness, with further changes through the dispossession of their whenua land by way of the Native Land Courts and suppression of their language through the Native Schools Act 1867. These changes continue to have ramifications today. Most people in 19th century New Zealand were Christian. Most were Anglican, with others being Methodist Wesleyan, Roman Catholic, and Presbyterian. Judaism also arrived very early on in New Zealand's colonisation. Many Māori converted to Christianity, a process that began before colonisation, with many of them combining Christianity and their traditional beliefs and customs. Letter writing and shipping was the main form of communication in the 19th century and was the only form for the first 3.5 decades. New Zealand's first international telegram line was laid in 1876 between Waka Puaka in Marlborough and La Perouse in New South Wales, Australia. This technology was expensive, initially only limited to the government and select businesses. In the 19th century, many people could not read or write, though likely practice oratories common, for example, in Māori communities. As a researcher interested in New Zealand, I am fortunate that Papers Past, a free online database of digitised documents exists, especially Pākehā newspapers and New Pepper Māori. I use Hemi Whaanga and Priscilla Wehi's keyword approach to search these records for mentions of ancient Egypt. I searched by Egypt and Ehipa. I used some exclusion criteria though. First, I excluded articles that did not mention ancient Egypt in a meaningful way. For example, the increase of mentions of Egypt in 1882 with the British invasion of Egypt saw an increase of reference to Egypt as the dominion of the pharaohs, but did not discuss ancient Egypt in depth. I did include, however, pieces from modern writers like Dr. James Copland in the Otago Witness, who published their responses to ancient Egypt in newspapers. Second, I included a single entry for articles that appeared multiple times in a single newspaper or across multiple newspapers. Copy and pasting was an important and common technique newspapers used to disseminate information across New Zealand. In the process of trawling through the various newspaper clippings, I identified 6 main types of articles that allowed 19th century New Zealanders to encounter ancient Egypt in newspapers, as listed on the board. I briefly will go through these distinctions of each type before I continue on to more information about general trends identified through reading the range of material. General pieces on a range of topics related to ancient Egypt was the most common way the public encountered ancient Egypt in 19th century New Zealand. Articles included topics on monuments, botany and paleontology, mummy peas, horses, Egyptian religion, glass, Masonic beliefs, romance, spinning and weaving, toys, life in ancient Egypt, poetry, mummy mining for manure, and education, among many, many others. These topics were the brainchildren of New Zealand journalists, all brought from overseas and reprinted. These kinds of articles appeared more in Pākehā newspapers than in New Pepa Māori. Many of these topics also appeared as anecdotes and snippets in other articles too. Reports on excavations and artifacts, though like general pieces, function slightly differently. Increasingly common from the 1870s, these articles responded to the larger numbers of sites and artifacts excavated in Egypt and gaining prominence in Europe, including the skyrocketing of excavators like Gaston Maspero and William Matthew Flinders Petrie into colonial prominence. These articles tended to be factual in nature, detailing the excavation or artifact, but did not prevent journalists from adding their 2 cents. Between discovery or excavation and then publication in New Zealand took some time because of the time lag that existed with getting information across the world. Artifacts appear to have been of interest for European settlers like Papyrus Harris I, the Ebers medical papyrus, the Amana letters, Cleopatra's needle, and the royal cache at Dao Bahri. Very few mentions of articles like these appear in New Pepa Māori. Significant excerpts from published books and travelogues were often printed in newspapers. These could be standalone articles or form part of another article. For example, in September 1881, excerpts from Canon Rawlinson's History of Egypt and George Eber's Egypt Descriptive, Historical and Picturesque were printed in the New Zealand Herald. The earliest example I found was from John Tim's Things Not Generally Known in October 1858. Dr. Copland's My Pilgrimage to Palestine is an example of a travelogue series published in the Otago Witness in 1876. Not everyone in New Zealand could access books, and public libraries were user subscription only. These excerpts tended to be published in Pākehā newspapers, with only a couple existing in New Pepa Māori. A combined category, advertising notices and advertising summaries of public lectures, provides insight into how people heard about ancient Egypt. For example, books on ancient Egypt appeared in sales advertisements from the 1840s to 1870s, and a play of Shakespeare's Mark Antony and Cleopatra was advertised in 1881. The most common evidence for advertising comes from notices for public lectures. These lectures took place in a range of venues, ranging from community buildings like schoolrooms and churches to larger venues like the Auckland Institute and Museum. No example of these kinds of advertising exist in New Pepa Māori. Summaries of public lectures often appeared in newspapers, providing insight into the colonial interplay between ancient Egypt, presenters, and audiences. These lectures covered a range of topics, including ancient Egyptian society and culture, artifacts, museums, and visitations. Several lectures and their presenters have been identified, so far 26 in total, and forms part of an ongoing project. The newspaper often provides insights into the responses to lectures. Spoiler alert, it was usually well received, and occasionally a sense of the space that these talks took place in, as indicated on the board. I recognise, however, that public lectures were not necessarily public, with people being excluded due to ethnicity, social class, and inability to afford tickets. Often letters appeared within newspapers, letters to editors being the most common. Letters to editors were selected, edited, and published by editing teams, with people sending their sending their views in response to previous issues of the newspaper or an event. Occasionally, a journalist might write a letter to an editor to be published. These letters provide direct evidence of the responses from the public to ancient Egypt and New Zealand. For instance, a letter published in 1879, written by John Leith, was incredibly critical of Piazzi Smythe's The Great Pyramid. Pseudonyms were also commonly used in these letters. Māori engaged with these letter-writing practices, but I have not been able to find any examples in New Paper Māori relating to ancient Egypt specifically. A second kind of letter, less commonly used, were the publishing of personal correspondence. For example, a letter by Julian von Haast, the director of Canterbury Museum, to his son was published in January 1887. The letter had arrived from von Haast while he was overseas collecting artifacts for the museum, having sent the letter the previous November to New Zealand. The final type of article comes in the form of acquisitions of ancient Egyptian antiquities to New Zealand. These articles, like excavations and artifacts, but contain distinctly New Zealand-related information. Most notably, 4 of the 5 complete human mummified remains in New Zealand received special treatment in newspapers related to their donations or acquisitions by their respective museums. It seems that other artifacts did not receive as much attention as mummified remains. One of the rare instances published in newspapers comes from a reference to L.D. Nathan's donation of Egyptian antiquities to the Auckland Institute and Museum in 1883, as indicated on the board. I personally love the uniquely New Zealand reference to the kauri, a long-lived New Zealand tree with particularly hardwood and used in buildings. Object 11156 is likely the object referenced in the article, now housed at the Auckland War Memorial Museum, Tamaki Paingahera. No examples of these kinds of reports were published in New Paper Māori. So, what can this evidence tell us as researchers? I introduced some preliminary findings based on the reading of a variety of materials offered. As the 19th century progressed, public encounters with ancient Egypt in newspapers increased, leading to more and more being published. New Zealand inherited a range of colonial outlooks already present in the British colonial campaign, especially around race. Many of these ideas reified imperialist, orientalist, and racialized understandings by the British. For example, Pākehā newspapers tended to use more evocative language than New Paper Māori when discussing topics of ancient Egypt, even though newspapers mostly stated facts. Many European writers simply dismissed ancient Egyptian ideas as folly, stemming from imported Orientalist frames. For the European New Zealander, ancient Egypt was both civilized and primitive at the same time, reinforcing the Occident-Orient divide, but in a colonial setting. Similar approaches applied to how Europeans interacted with Māori. Māori seem in New Paper Māori to focus on concerns and issues pertinent to their living experience in New Zealand, and may reflect the reduced number of mentions within New Paper compared to newspapers of ancient Egypt. Focusing on one aspect of colonial identity, I emphasize the prominent role of Christianity in how New Zealanders received ancient Egypt. For many, ancient Egypt caught their fascination because of its similarities and differences from Christianity. However, Christianity's influence went deeper. I argue that New Zealanders likely could not understand ancient Egypt without reference to Christianity, their identity and religion being one and the same. Many of the Bible's stories have connection to Egypt, including Moses in the Exodus, Joseph, King Solomon, Jesus is fleeing with his parents, Abraham and the flood, with many people, Pākehā and Māori, learning of these in Sunday school. Most articles included Christianity in some way, either to date something in ancient Egypt or explain a contemporary event. For example, Abraham and the flood tended to date ancient things earlier than the New Kingdom, while the plagues of Egypt were compared to a blackout experienced in Wellington in 1895, specifically referring to locusts and darkness. Christianity permeated Pākehā and Māori society, who were immersed in these teachings. Māori did not encounter Egypt in the same way as Pākehā, their first encounter occurring through the Bible and therefore from the outset through a Christian lens. For example, in 1884, 2 king lists were published in Korimako, which explicitly linked ancient Egyptian kings with biblical stories, such as Ramesses II to Mohi, Moses, or Tutmosis I to Horhepa, Joseph. One thing to note is that Māori translated biblical and English words into Te Reo Māori, such as Ramihi for Ramesses, Amenemhotep for Amenhotep, and Totemi for Tutmosis, making their own understanding of these words. Similar practices occurred in Pākehā newspapers, like in 1882, an article aimed at explaining Egyptological terms using Christianity to position the 18th and 19th dynasties in relation to biblical stories. Most articles on ancient Egypt interwove Christianity in, directly or indirectly. An unusual thing that did happen in New Zealand was the mixing of non-Christian doctrine, such as social Darwinism, with Christianity, likely a response to New Zealand's late entry into the British Empire. Finally, New Zealand never experienced an Egyptomania in the same way as other British colonial contexts. For example, vast cemeteries and a sporadic monument, like the obelisk atop Maungakiki, One Tree Hill in Auckland, no 19th century buildings exhibit or exhibited Egyptian revival architecture. It is not until the 1930s in Napier when Egyptian stylings crept into architecture, the result of a major earthquake in the region in 1931. I argue that New Zealand's late entry into the British Empire resulted in this pattern. In trying to create a Britain of the South Seas, colonial administrators focused on establishing law and order in an unruly landscape and to control unruly people, Pākehā and Māori alike. New Zealand was administered from Australia until 1853 when its government was set up. The government then changed form in 1876 and then again in 1890. At the same time, the government fought wars on behalf of the Crown and led to significant migrations of people to New Zealand. The government also focused on extracting resources from the land, which included clearing forests and draining swamps like in the Waikato. People also tended to be of lower social classes, like domestic workers, gold miners, loggers, and farmers, who did not necessarily care as much about ancient Egypt because of their focus on survival. Māori, as mentioned before, focused on their own concerns rather than things happening outside of New Zealand. The lack of Egyptomania confirms Ella Stevenson's conclusion as to why Pākehā seem ambivalent to the inclusion of ancient Egyptian artifacts into the 1906 International Exhibition in Christchurch. What this paper does not confirm is the interest by Māori in ancient Egypt, which warrants further investigation. People were interested in ancient Egypt, but that this interest was not experienced in the same way between Pākehā and Māori, nor across social classes. The interest in Pākehā communities likely stems from their cultural and social background. A fatal flaw in this study is that many people remain unseen in the public sphere of newspapers, such as Māori and European women and other non-British people. The colonial identities and Christianity also directly influence how the public received ancient Egypt. Therefore, much work is needed to comprehensively examine colonial reception of ancient Egypt in 19th century New Zealand. Kia ora for coming to this talk, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Reuben. That was absolutely fantastic. I know a lot of reception studies tend to focus on the US and the UK, so it's so nice to see the New Zealand perspective on it as well. Do we have any questions? Oh, I see a hand's already up. Look at that.
I have 2 questions. The first is, have you had trouble, obviously you're dealing with different languages, very different languages. Obviously, you've got English, but then you've got Maori. And is there issues when it comes to Egyptian terms? And then they've gone from Egyptian to English, and like, is meaning lost in that sort of sense? And then my second question is, how are you dealing with the data that you're sort of uncovering?
You've got time to have a think while I walk back.
Two fantastic questions. So tackling the first one, when you're sort of dealing with multiple languages, which in New Zealand we're very fortunate that we have it written down. A lot of colonial contexts don't have that, but have that option available. In terms of working with Te Reo Māori, the Māori language, a lot of it, most of the time it's simply just changing it to probably be able to be pronounced by other Māori speakers, because I guess the way that they speak their language is quite substantially different. You may have heard quite jarring differences in how I was saying my pepeha at the beginning, switching from te reo to English and back to te reo. So those sorts of sounds would have made it difficult for some of the Māori community who didn't know English at the time. Sort of in doing that, a lot of the times, as the one I showed on the slide, what they would do is they would translate it, but also keep the English in for the people who didn't necessarily know what the Māori word was. And so that was a common way that they did that. The benefit of, I guess, modern society is that we do have access to tools like Google Translate and also other AI support to help with the translations, which Te Reo Māori is one of the ones that helps, is input into the system. So it's not like I can't read it, which is very helpful. In terms of your second question around the data management of it, I am at the moment using a Excel spreadsheet where I sort of record the newspaper, the date, the page number, what category I would apply to it. So my general pieces in my database at the moment are all called fluff, because I think one of the things that they're doing with it is simply using them to fill out the newspaper, because these things, I'm sure many of us have seen 19th century newspapers, they're chocker full of stuff. And so I think if they're running low on stuff, they'll be like, oh, we got this article, let's just throw it in there and see what happens. And then sort of any additional information that's relevant from that article specifically. I also keep track of like any notes that I have around what is this article saying, how, if we apply like a modern lens to it, what are the things, how Orientalist is it, how much racism is in it, how have they understood the material, and then kind of adjusted it for a New Zealand audience. But hopefully that has answered both your questions.
Thank you. Any other questions in the room before I cross over to the Zoom? Yeah. She's grinning. It's going to be a tricky one.
No, no. I'm just really curious as to the lack of Egyptomania in New Zealand. Is that only on the Maori side of the community, or was among the like white colonial community, is that also not present? And on the back of that, how did Egyptology develop as a field of study in New Zealand? Because that's kind of how it developed here in Europe. So.
And I'm going to be cheeky. I had a question that kind of ties in with that about the collecting practices. So you mentioned mummified remains and that statue, but is there a particular object type that seems to be particularly popular in the collections? 3 questions at once, easy.
Okay, let's see if I can do this. So in terms of your first question around the lack of Egyptomania. So Pākehā means European, basically in New Zealand European. It's present in both. By 1906, when Ella Stevenson that's the thing that she's focused on from a museology perspective. When it comes to that point, Pākehā, we don't care. It's the weirdest thing. And then Māori seem to have more of an interest. Going back into the 19th century material, it kind of becomes clear that yes, there was substantial interest in ancient Egypt. However, it never really materialized into the culture as it did, say, in Australia, the States, or in Britain itself. So yeah, it just seems people were interested, but they weren't interested enough to have it influence their lived experience. In terms of the second question around the development of Egyptology, Egyptology was not in New Zealand in the 19th century at all. New Zealand started to get more of an active interest in ancient Egypt after the First World War, when New Zealand troops were stationed in the Suez in northern Egypt in order to access Gallipoli in Turkey, and then the Western Front later in the war. And so a lot of the materials that we have in New Zealand actually come from that point onwards. The ones that I mentioned are few and far between in the 19th century. So the development of Egyptology as a field I would hazard to guess it started in Australia and then kind of jumped over the Tasman Sea. There is one article. There's a real dearth of information on New Zealand and Egypt. There's one article that looks at the development of Egyptology in Australia and New Zealand, and it's definitely more of a thing in Australia than it was in New Zealand until probably the 70s. And so that's really the strong one, and I think that article was published by Boyo Okinga out of Australia, even though he was also connected to New Zealand as well. So that's a fun one to unpack. But with this, I really wanted to step away from the Egyptology and more examine the public, to say, what are the public doing? How are the public understanding these things? Over to the third question around collecting practices. In the 19th century, very much all the articles that are published on artifacts really heavily influence on human mummified remains. In New Zealand, all of our mummified remains came in the 19th century. We received none post the turn of the century. We may have received bits of mummies, but we don't receive any full ones. In terms of other objects, generally it's quite a spread. There's nothing really specific in any of our collections. I know Ella Stevenson talks about how after the Second World War, the understanding of Egypt and the interest in Egypt kind of led to New Zealand having, I'm going to get the quote wrong, but it's something along the lines of having modest collections because we just really didn't collect anything, and most of the stuff that came in were from people who went to Egypt and came back, coming back from the UK or elsewhere in Europe, or they were soldiers bringing back the materials and then they ended up in the museums. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time, so should we quickly cross over to Valentina in the land of Zoom and see if we've got one question online?
Yeah, we actually have lots of questions. So
Would you be able to have a look at the chat
maybe-
after, Reuben?
yeah, exactly. If it's possible, I'd ask also the couple of people who raised their hand to write their questions down, and maybe Reuben, if you can answer them later, that would be fantastic. Thank you. But maybe I can ask the very first of these questions. Do we have time?
Yeah, we'll allow one.
Okay, great. So, great talk. Thanks. Sir John Logan Campbell, known as the father of Auckland, traveled through Egypt in the 19th century for 2 or 3 years. Do you know anything about his history or legacy?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So Logan Campbell was a really prominent dude within like the city of Auckland, which in the 19th century and today was kind of like our largest city. It's sort of outstrips everything. And so he was an important like entrepreneur, traveler, collector, all of the normal things that you would expect from a 19th century dude. In terms of, I guess, his influence on like sort of Egypt and New Zealand, he's the one who designed let me see if I can get back to it. He designed this monument on Maungakiki, One Tree Hill. He also did donate a bunch of materials to the Auckland Institute and Museum. However, because of the focus of sort of my data set being around newspapers at the moment, his stuff never makes it into the newspapers. So he sort of doesn't really have a presence around the objects that he sort of donated, gave to the museum and all of that. If anyone is interested in this, in Logan Campbell, there is a online article published by Julia Hamilton when she was still working at the Auckland War Memorial Museum, Tamaki Painga Hera, which sort of goes into detail around his life, his time in Egypt, him coming back, the influence on the community in New Zealand. But yeah, he just really doesn't have a presence outside of like his other work. He has no presence in the newspapers for being related to Egypt. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was really, really fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have another round of applause for Reuben, please. That was fantastic.